Are we willing to encounter God that way? Or are we so desensitized to everything that we can't even recognize the most powerful thing in the universe has given us his word and described in exact detail history before it unfolded? We should be astonished. It should make us sick to our stomachs that we let dust collect on our Bibles because of how powerful it is. When God speaks, it's astonishing. Are we in awe of God? Are we humbled before him? What is our reaction to his word? Because what his word tells us is this: it was all leading to something. One thing that's already happened and another thing that is yet to come. This morning we're going to be in Daniel chapter 8. So if you want to follow along, that's where you want to be, Daniel chapter 8. So we're back in the book of Daniel. We're hoping to finish it this, if not this summer, quickly after the summer, but Daniel chapter 8. Now, thinking through what we're going to be talking about tonight and remembering kind of where we left off last time we were in Daniel, which is chapter 7. I know. I can count, so that's a good sign for this morning. 7, then 8. Daniel chapter 7 was a list of visions of different types of animals and beasts that Daniel saw, where it led to ultimately the end, this great beast and powerful army or political kingdom and that will be in existence at the end of days. And so Daniel 8 mirrors some of what chapter 7 was. You know, you saw the beast, in particular the bear that was lifted up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth, and then a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And while that might sound like I'm just having a fever dream from the overnight, it really is actually what Daniel saw, and he described that vision, and we talked about that in Daniel chapter 7. That will come into play as we talk about chapter 8. But before we get there, I just want to share what I think this is really about. I mean, not necessarily what the visions are about, we'll get into that, but what we can learn from it and what we should take from it, especially with how Daniel ends this chapter, is there's this feeling of awe, this feeling of the fear of the Lord, this unbelievable, incomprehensible thing that Daniel sees and is opened up as he gets this vision and he meets an angel, and all of it leaves Daniel faint and in fear of God with this sort of inspired fear, you know, kind of on his knees before God, faint, but also just in shock of what God is able to do. And I think we live in a society where we're so desensitized to everything, we don't really feel that shock and awe anymore all the time. You know, waking up this morning, I looked over at the headlines and I read about the, attack on Iran and the bunker busters that went through. And I'm talking about Iran and the Middle East and what's happening with Israel as I'm reading in the book of Daniel stuff about the end times and, but I just kind of shrug my shoulders like, it's to be expected. This is what I wake up to every morning. For the last several years, we've been dealing with headlines about Israel and its neighbors and war in Ukraine and whether or not the economy is going to go up or down and all sorts of global fear with pandemics and all kinds of things that are going on in the world. And, I'm so desensitized to everything. I was thinking, when is the last time I really felt the shock of the world? When's the last time that happened for me? And, it'll become pretty obvious to you. I remember there was a day in my life, and it was a normal day like any other day. I'm walking through the halls of school. I was in high school at the time, and pretty normal day. You walk by all the lockers, you see people chattering and talking to each other, teachers standing outside their classroom, telling kids to get in the classroom because the bell has already rang. That's kind of a normal thing. But I remember walking into class and it being different. The halls were silent for the first of all, a whole school full of teenagers without a word being spoken is just unbelievable. And so walking through silent halls, you realize how eerie that building is when there's not a bunch of noise bustling around. I walk into a classroom and the teacher tells me that class is canceled. But instead of shouts of joy for the fact that we didn't have class, still dead silence. And the teacher told us we could go to the library if we wanted. And I said, okay, I'll go to the library. I walk into the library and all the TV screens are on and all I see are smoke billowing from New York City. And everyone has this shock and awe on their face and they're silent. And I don't really know what's going on yet until the footage shows the plane going into one of the Twin Towers. And then I remember the dread, because that was the one thing I never expected to see. That America was attacked on American soil. And as I'm sitting there watching the news and they're showing this coverage, the second plane comes and hits the tower. And I was glued to that seat in the library for the rest of the day. And I remember when the plane hit the Pentagon, and then another plane went down in a field. And I remember for the first time feeling like I wasn't safe. As a kid, in this world, and in the West, and in America in particular, I've never had that feeling before. I never felt like we were at risk. But for the first time in my life, I felt that sense of dread. And it's a moment that stuck with me throughout my entire life. I'll never forget that day. I'll never forget that moment. I'll never forget the seat I was sitting in when I found out what was happening. And it's really funny now on the, 20-something years later, in youth ministry, when I share this student with kids who were not alive when it happened. And the questions that they have about what was that like, because they have never felt the dread that I felt. They don't understand it at all. And when I think about the type of dread and fear and awe of that moment, that's the closest thing I can think of what Daniel must have been feeling at this moment. And for any of you who are alive when that happened, you know what you felt like in that moment. I am assuming that pales in comparison with standing before God or hearing his messages. So let's try to remember or think through what it's like to actually be shocked, to be removed from all of the desensitizing that culture has on us when we hear bad news and we forget what it's like. Let's actually think, can we remember a time of shock and awe and dread as we go through this portion of Scripture? Now, before we go into the actual verses, I want to recap sort of what we've talked about thus far and the impressiveness of the book of Daniel by reading to you an excerpt from a book by Dr. David Jeremiah. Dr. David Jeremiah wrote a book called The Handwriting on the Wall, which is about the book of Daniel, and it's defending the book of Daniel against the skeptics. And he writes it as though it's like a courtroom drama, as though the prosecutor is the world and the skeptics trying to bring arguments against the book of Daniel from being written before 500 BC, because the prophecies within Daniel are so crazy, they're so specific and so accurate that if Daniel was really written when it's supposed to have been written, it basically proves that it's supernatural, because of the future events that it predicts are so clear and so specific, it could have only come from a supernatural source. And so the argument is that Daniel must have been written after the fact. And these are the kind of arguments and sway that he's talking about as he unfolds this sort of courtroom drama. So Dr. Jeremiah writes this. He says, when Ezekiel takes the witness stand, he is very sure of Daniel's existence and writing. For they were neighbors in Babylon. If the prosecution does not believe Daniel, then they have a problem with Ezekiel also. Now, David Jeremiah brings this up because Ezekiel is one of the books that scholars trust the most in terms of ancient history and biblical Old Testament literature. And so if Ezekiel affirms the existence and the writing of Daniel, now you've got a serious problem. And he points this out by quoting Ezekiel 14. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, if a country sins against me by being unfaithful, and I stretch out my hand against it to cut off its food supply, and send famine upon it and kill its men and their animals, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they could only save themselves by their righteousness, declares the sovereign Lord. That's Ezekiel 14, verses 12 through 14. And so as he presents this case in this sort of courtroom drama, he says, if the prosecutors can't deal with Daniel, they will also have to call Noah and Job to the witness stand too, pointing out that Ezekiel affirms the existence and writing of Daniel within the book of Ezekiel, which is one of the more trusted ancient books by skeptical scholars of the Old Testament. So if Ezekiel affirms Daniel, Daniel must have written, at least in part, portion of the book of Daniel. And he goes on to really open up this sort of courtroom drama. And he says if the prosecution cannot discredit the witnesses, then, because Daniel existed, then they search for contradictions in its testimony. The first and second verses of the book of Daniel say that Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of Babylon, took vessels from the temple at Jerusalem and brought them into the treasury of his God. Never heard of such a thing, says the prosecuting attorney. That was completely unknown custom. We can't find any reference in ancient history to such a practice. Suddenly, the archaeologists burst into the room, brushing dirt from their hands and placing their shovels and sieves in front of the judge. They have discovered an inscription that proves Nebuchadnezzar always put his choicest spoils into his house of worship. Just one of the peculiar habits of the king. In the first chapter of Daniel, there's reference to a fellow by the name of Ashpenaz, who was master of the eunuchs. The prosecution says, no one has ever heard of this fellow. He was just another fictional character out of Daniel's fantasy. But during the last century, the name Ashpenaz has been found on monuments of ancient Babylon. And it says, Ashpenaz, master of eunuchs in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. So now if the prosecution can't trip the defendant on his details, he can cast doubt on his credibility. The opponents of the word of God love to say, but the Bible contradicts itself. In the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel, the story is told of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, who is said to have been slain during the drunken feast of the night Babylon fell. Secular history says the king of Babylon at the time was Nabonidus. So who's right? No one knew how to reconcile these two accounts until Sir Henry Rawlinson discovered an inscription on a cylinder found in the Euphrates River. It cleared up the problem. There were two kings of Babylon during Daniel's later life. A father and a son, Nabonidus, who occupied a stronghold outside the city, and his oldest son, Belshazzar, as co-regent. He allowed him to use the royal title. Belshazzar was slain defending the city of Babylon. Nabonidus was spared. This detail explains Daniel 5:29, where it says, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain placed around his neck. He was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Daniel was the third ruler because there were already two others, Nabonidus and Belshazzar. So the prosecutor returns to his seat and searches for more incriminating evidence to indict Daniel. This point goes to show that in this sort of courtroom drama, this idea of trying to tear apart the book of Daniel, history and archaeology keeps coming up saying Daniel wins. Daniel's right about the very details of his life when he was alive. See, history has affirmed Daniel's accounts of the details that he wrote while he was alive in the kingdom of Babylon. Daniel, and the following chapter we are about to read, was written around 550 BC. This is an important detail because it means that we're about to read predictions that are incredible in detail. They happen hundreds of years in the future. So Daniel writes about details of his life while he's alive that are affirmed by history and archaeology, which means we can place Daniel around 550 BC as he's writing the words we're going to read. But he's writing things that happen a few hundred years later, which means Daniel was written before these events took place. So his ability to describe these details before they happen, and we can affirm the details by being in the future, and we can see Daniel's prediction come to complete fruition, means that we should be astonished, and we should be in shock and awe of who God is. This shows us that God knows the end from the beginning, and that he used his prophets to give us his word. It shows us that God knows the end from the beginning. It shows us that the scriptures themselves are wholly inspired and also altogether holy, meaning separate, unlike any other, from a heavenly source. So Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were very high. But one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will. And he became great. So remember, Daniel chapter 7, the vision of the bear who is lifted up on one side with the 3 ribs in its mouth. Daniel is saying that that was the first vision, and this vision that he's having in Daniel chapter 8 is connected to that. There was a bear with one side lifted up. In this vision, there's a ram with 2 horns, but one horn was larger than the other horn, but that horn sprouted up later. This is speaking of the Medo-Persian Empire. And like we talked about last time, Cyrus the Persian, when he took the throne of the Medo-Persian Empire, before him, the Medes sort of utilized the Persians as their servant class. But when Cyrus the Persian took the throne, he lifted up the Persians above the Medes. And this is related to that vision. And he continues to say, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Now, the vision moved from this ram to this goat that's flying across the land. It's not even touching the ground. It's moving so fast, it's flying. The rest of this chapter moves from the kingdom of Persia to the kingdom of Greece, as it moves from this ram with 2 horns to this goat flying across the land. And this is also connected to Daniel chapter 7, which was the leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings that flew with great speed and overtook the world. This is like Alexander the Great, the notable horn from between the eyes. So this goat flying across the land and the leopard are the same. They're both moving with incredible speed. The notable horn, and a horn in the Old Testament and throughout Scripture, is often reference of military or political power. And this is Alexander the Great, who happened to conquer the world within 3.5 years, from ages 30 to 33. And so from the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greeks conquered them through Alexander the Great quickly. Then came the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power, and I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. There was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Now, the difference between the ram and this goat is that the ram is filled with power, has these 2 big horns, and it's overwhelming its enemies, which is, by the way that the Persians would fight their wars. They would overwhelm their enemy with sheer numbers. They would amass a huge army, and they were willing to lose members of the army by just swallowing them up in numbers. But the Greeks, the way that they fought under Alexander the Great was just quick and tactical. And because of that, the Persians had no answer. And Alexander the Great, in order to conquer the world, had to conquer the biggest empire, which at the time was the Persians. And he did it quickly from ages 30 to 33. There was nothing that the Persian Empire could do to defeat Alexander's tactics. Now it says, therefore, the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up, and toward the four winds of heaven. So on this goat, this goat that has one horn that's very great, this horn is broken. Alexander the Great dies at the age of 33. And it says four horns took its place. Just like the leopard that represented Alexander the Great had ended up with four heads. Now, in Alexander the Great's life, it says that when he died, they asked him what to do with his kingdom, and he said, "Give it to the strong." And he gave his kingdom to four different generals. Those generals are Cassander, who took over the area of Greece and Macedonia, what Alexander started with. Lysimachus took over Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. Ptolemy took over Egypt, North Africa, and Arabia, the majority of the Middle East. And Seleucus, who overtook Syria and Babylon, which is the major focus of the rest of this chapter. Now, the kingdom of Ptolemy and the kingdom of Seleucus had a lot of civil wars fighting over the Holy Land, trying to get the piece of land that was in between their two kingdoms. And ultimately, the Seleucid Empire took over that land in the end. But it says, out of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So that's that depiction of the Seleucid Empire winning that long war between them and the Ptolemaic Empire and taking over the Holy Land. But as they did that, there was this empire, or this family that was particularly evil, known as they were the Antiochus lineage. And this little horn that was referenced in the last chapter, in chapter 7, the little horn there was referenced to the end of days, talking about the final Antichrist that's part of that final kingdom. So why in chapter 8 is there a little horn that's about the Seleucid Empire? Why is there this little horn that comes out of the Greek Empire? What is this talking about? Well, the little horn that came out of the Seleucid Empire happens to be a foreshadowing in history of the ultimate event that will take place at the end of the final deceiver before Christ returns. That picture of in Daniel chapter 2, where that stone that's uncut comes down and tears down that statue by landing at the feet of that final kingdom and toppling all of the government of man when Jesus returns, that's the picture. But speaking of that little horn, it said it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and it trampled them, and he even exalted himself as the high prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down because of the transgression. An army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. When I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 days." Or if you're reading a different translation, like the ESV, it might say 2,300 mornings and evenings. That's important. "Then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." So this little horn is speaking of a member of the Antiochus family, specifically Antiochus IV, who gave himself a name, Antiochus Epiphanes, meaning he believed he was divine. And this happened in the 200 to 300 range BC, a couple hundred years after Daniel was alive. This king rised up out of the Seleucid Empire, and he overtook the Jews, and he hated them. In fact, he hated them so much he persecuted them and killed many. And he got so fed up with them that ultimately what he did was he took a statue that he had made to look like Zeus. So he made a statue of Zeus, but he put his own face on the statue, representing himself as this divine authority. And he placed that statue in the temple, and then he sacrificed a pig at the temple, and then forced the Jews to eat the sacrificed meat from the pig at the temple to make them unclean before their God. He did all of this because he hated them so much. And this happened. This is what is being described here, and this happens. Daniel is summarizing history for us, but to him, it's the future. And he's describing it in incredible detail. And here's the thing. It says when Daniel meets, he hears this voice, booming voice from heaven, telling an angel, Gabriel, to tell Daniel what this is. And this angel tells Daniel that 2,300 days are going to be what you're going to deal with this type of tyrant, desecrating the temple and God's sanctuary and coming after God's people. Now, a lot of commentators will point out that, well, it could mean 2,300 days, or it could mean 2,300 mornings and evenings, which means it could be talking about 2,300 of the daily sacrifices. Because at the temple, they sacrifice in the morning and in the evening. The interesting thing about that is whatever translation you're reading, it's accurate. Because the 2,300 days or 2,300 sacrifices equal two different things. If you believe that this sort of event that took place from Antiochus is representative of 2,300 sacrifices, that happens to be the exact length of time from when he desecrated the temple by placing that statue and slaughtering the pig at the temple and forcing them to eat it until the temple was cleansed. 2,300 sacrifices. However, he started persecuting the Jews before he desecrated the temple. And the length of time from Antiochus' beginning of torturing and persecuting the Jews until the day that the temple was cleansed is 2,300 days in history. So both of those translations actually equal out to historical truth, to the day. Because what happened when Antiochus did that, there's a group of people called the Maccabees, and Judas Maccabeus led a revolt against Antiochus. And they finally conquered him and got the temple back. And this is the story of Hanukkah. When they conquered Antiochus and his army and were able to get the temple back for themselves, they cleansed the temple. And when they cleansed the temple, they lit the lamp back inside the temple, but they only had enough oil for one night. But it turns out that the oil lasted for 8 days and 8 nights, which was the amount of time it took to make more olive oil for the lampstand. And that's the story of Hanukkah. Daniel predicted all of this. And then you hear this moment from heaven. It says, "It happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice from the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, 'Gabriel, make this man understand the vision.'" And so Daniel actually hears God telling Gabriel to help Daniel understand. That should be a moment of shock and awe in itself. And so Gabriel starts revealing to Daniel what the meaning of this vision is. So he came near where I stood, and when he came to me, I was afraid, and I fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." Now, wait a second. Because the little horn is clearly referencing Antiochus Epiphanes, which is not the end times. It's not before the return of Christ. And Daniel 7 mentions a little horn that is about the end times. So what is this all about? We get a glimpse of what ties these two together in Matthew chapter 24, when Jesus answers the questions that his disciples ask about the end. And Jesus says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Historical reference. This is a historical reference that reveals a future truth. In Jesus' time, the Jews referred to what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes as the abomination of desolation because of what he did to Solomon's temple. Or I should say, Zerubbabel's temple. What he did was called the abomination of desolation. Now, Jesus is saying, in the future, when you see the abomination of desolation, know that the end is near. So a historical event is a picture or a shadow of what the future will bring. So he's speaking of what Antiochus did and saying that is how you know who the Antichrist is at the very end. So this shadow of the past predicts the future, which is true in general of a lot of biblical prophecy. And now Daniel, as he's listening to the angel, this is what is said. As he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and stood me upright, and he said, Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. For at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. Now, all right, in case you were thinking, how do you even know about these different details that it really refers to the kingdom of Persia and Greece and Alexander the Great? Well, the angel told Daniel in explicit detail that the ram is the kingdom of Media and Persia, and they're coming to destroy the Babylonians. And then, a couple hundred years in the future, the kingdom of Greece will arise, and that horn, the first horn, is its first king, which is Alexander the Great. And so he gives you in explicit detail the future that to us is history, and so we know exactly how detailed and specific and accurate God is, seeing the end from the beginning. It says, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Well, if that doesn't sound like Antiochus Epiphanes, I don't know who is. You know, this king who will arise, having fierce features, so fierce apparently, he thought he needed to make his features the features of Zeus and put them in the Jews' temple, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy temple. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. He shall be broken without human means, and the vision of the evening and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. So Daniel is given this prediction in this vision to incredible detail, even naming by name the kingdom of Media and Persia and the kingdom of Greece, hundreds of years in the future, and then ultimately a future we have yet to see in the final Antichrist. Daniel gives these exact details, and through how specifically they were fulfilled in the past, we can have hope for the fulfillment in the future. And after seeing all of this, this is what Daniel says. This is his reaction. I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. After I arose and went about the king's business, I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. That's the end of chapter 8. And that was Daniel's reaction. He was faint and sick for days. And after that, when he was able to get back up, he was astonished. That is what made me think of my reaction to 9/11. I remember being sick and glued to the TV for days. I remember watching news anchors stay up for like 72 hours and start to grow a beard on camera and start to get irritated with people as they're waiting to find out what really went on. And we were all sick and scared for days and just being astonished by what happened. That pales in comparison to having a direct vision or encounter with the one true God. And so Daniel gives us his reaction. He was fainted and sick for days and ultimately astonished. Are we willing to encounter God that way? Or are we so desensitized to everything that we can't even recognize the most powerful thing in the universe has given us his word and described in exact detail history before it unfolded? We should be astonished. It should make us sick to our stomachs that we let dust collect on our Bibles because of how powerful it is. When God speaks, it's astonishing. Are we in awe of God? Are we humbled before him? What is our reaction to his word? Because what his word tells us is this. It was all leading to something one thing that's already happened and another thing that is yet to come. It tells us the story of the Messiah. It points to Jesus who came to take away our sin on the cross and reconcile us to God. To take our sin and our punishment and take the wrath of God on himself against what we are guilty for, so that we could be reconciled with God and have a relationship with him. And it tells these incredible details of history throughout time so that we can know God is supernatural and knows the end from the beginning, and we can trust what he says. And he gives us this word, and the cross stands in the center of history saying, "Come to me, because I have one more promise. Not only did I do this for you, not only did I take away your sins so that you could be reconciled with me and have a relationship with me and experience eternal life, but I'm coming again. And when I come again, I'm setting up my kingdom that will never end. And we can go into eternity together and spend eternity with each other in relationship because you came to God and you put your sin at the foot of the cross. And I'm going to give you a new body that can withstand eternity, that will withstand the temptation of sin. And you can experience eternity with God because of the promises of him. And so we should be in awe at what God says. Are we in awe of that? Are we living in its hope? And are we living in its victory? Can we take a moment to get beyond the headlines, to get beyond the anxiety, to get beyond the stresses of life of this world and say, look what God said. He predicted the future, and it happened in specific detail. Our God knows the end from the beginning, and he used his prophets to get our attention so that we could come to him knowing we can trust him. And then he gave his life for ours so that we could be given eternal life and have hope in his return. Do we have hope in the cross? And do we have hope in his coming again? And can we trust it because of what God says? And as all the skeptics hurl things at the book of Daniel, archaeology and history keeps coming up saying, you can trust God. It was written in the time I said it was written. I know the end before the beginning. And I love you. And I want your name written in the book of life so you can spend eternity with me. That's the hope we should live with. Can we take a moment and just be in awe and experience that shock once again?